lessons that just sort of make your hair stand on end. It is so biblical, fulfilling prophecies that are as high as 4,000 years old. Today we're looking at the Abraham Accord. In Genesis 15:18, we read about Abraham receiving a covenant from God. Abraham was offering a sacrifice to the Lord. The Bible tells us that God came down and walked among the pieces of the sacrifice. While God was doing this, Abraham fell into a trance. And while Abraham was in that trance, here's what happened, Genesis 15:18. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. This promise was made around 2,000 years, or around 2000 BC. Israel then lived in the promised land after spending 400 years in bondage in Egypt. They lived in the promised land from 1400 BC to 70 AD. Around 30 AD, Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed and that Jerusalem would be destroyed. Well, he prophesied that in 30 AD, and it came to pass 40 years later. In 70 AD, the Romans came, destroyed Jerusalem, and banished the Jewish people from Jerusalem and ultimately from the Promised Land. This began 2,000 years of exile for the Jewish people. However, God's promises never fail. And we're going to find out today that God's promise to Abraham that the Jewish people would have a home in the land of Israel, that promise, it will never fail, and it is being fulfilled right now in front of our eyes. Now, I want you to think about 2,000 years. The Jews lived in exile from 70 AD until 1948. Yet the promise was always there. It's an incredible thing. When the Jews fled the Romans to Masada around 68 to 70 AD, they hid up there from the Roman armies. And while they were there, they buried a copy of Ezekiel 37, which prophesies the rebirth of Israel someday. So they were holding on to that promise, even though it would be 2,000 years before it was fulfilled. So let's go to after the 2,000 years of exile. The nation of Israel was reborn in 1948. Hitler's Holocaust had driven the Jewish people. They said, we have to have our own homeland. 6 million Jews had died in the horrible Holocaust. So they were rushing like a flood back to the promised land. Now, it wasn't just the Holocaust. It was God's Spirit pulling them back. However, when the nation of Israel was reborn on May the 14th in 1948, all Arab nations refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. They immediately attempted to destroy the newborn nation. There were 5 Arab countries that converged on the tiny nation of Israel. They only had 600,000 people, counting the men, women, and children. These 5 nations came against them. They were not well equipped with arms. I mean, they'd just been born as a nation. However, Israel fought valiantly, plus God fought for Israel. At that time, when the Arabs realized they were not going to succeed, a ceasefire was declared. Jordan had come across the Jordan River to fight against the Jewish nation. Jordan didn't go back home. When the ceasefire was declared in 1949, Jordan stayed there, occupying what has become known as the West Bank. In biblical terms, it's Judea and Samaria. They stayed there for the next 19 years. Now, we're talking about the Abraham Accord just signed last week. We're going to tell you all about the events leading up to it today. Once the ceasefire was declared in 1949, Israel occupied what we call West Jerusalem, and Jordan occupied East Jerusalem, which included the Temple Mount and the West Bank. Well, that continued on until 1967. However, Nasser of Egypt, King Hussein of Jordan, and President Assad of Syria never gave up. They were determined to wipe the Jewish presence out from the Middle East. Little did they recognize that they were fighting against God himself. Well, Nasser announced that they were getting ready to launch a war against Israel, and the goal was the destruction of the nation of Israel. Israel realized it was coming and decided, we're not going to sit here like a sitting duck. So in early June, I believe it was June the 5th, their airplanes flew low over the Mediterranean Sea, 500 feet high, below radar detection, swept down into Egypt, the strongest Arab military force at the time. And they surprised Egypt so bad that 90% of Egypt's airplanes were destroyed before they could ever even start their engines. The war was virtually over before it could hardly start. The war ended up lasting for 6 days. Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. This tiny nation of Israel defeated all these old, strong Arab countries in 6 days' time. I remember it well. I was following it every minute of every day. And the world was shocked that the tiny nation of Israel could actually bring about such a victory. Most people realized this is not normal. The hand of God has to be in this. Preachers everywhere were preaching about the promise that the nation of Israel would be reborn. And now we're watching it unfold right in front of our eyes. Well, the 6 Days War, it was finished in June of 1967. However, the Arab powers were determined not to accept the existence of Israel. 2 months later, they met in Khartoum, Sudan. And there, all of the Arab powers came together and agreed. We're going to say no to negotiation, no to recognition, no to peace. They called it the 3 no's. It became famous. Well, when Israel realized that they had no partner in negotiation, what were they to do? Here they are now. They've occupied the entire West Bank. They've occupied the Sinai Desert in the south. They've occupied the Golan Heights in the north. And their enemies are all cowering in fear. Israel was willing to negotiate. She wanted to live in peace and security. But the 3 no's said no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. Well, it was later on in 1967 that the UN came together and passed Resolution 242. It happened on November the 22nd of 1967. And this resolution basically affirmed that the fulfillment of charter principles requires the establishment of a just, lasting peace in the Middle East, which should include the application of the two following principles. 1, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Now let's pause there. Notice the verbiage. Israel had to withdraw from territories. Notice that it does not say all territories. The Arab countries wanted the word all in there. However, Arthur Goldberg, who was our ambassador to the United Nations at the time, stood steadfast, as well as other Israeli allies. So they said Israel has to withdraw from territories occupied. Now, this is especially important because these territories belong to no one. Jordan had illegally occupied it for the last 19 years. So who were they going to withdraw and turn it over to? So the phrase said, Israel will need to withdraw from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Item number 2, termination of all claims or states' belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and listen close, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. Now, when it said they were allowed to live within secure and recognized boundaries, there were no recognized boundaries. After the War of Independence, when the ceasefire was declared in 1949, it was explicitly stated, these are not boundaries. This is only the ceasefire line. So Israel didn't even know where she should withdraw to. Furthermore, the resolution from the United Nations said that Israel should withdraw to secure boundaries. Well, there's a big problem with that because Israel was 9 miles wide at the waist. What nation could claim security when the entire width of your nation at one point is only 9 miles? The United Nations and other resolutions said that the boundaries should be concluded by negotiation between the interested parties. However, already the Arabs had said, no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. So Israel had no one to negotiate with. Well, that was in 1967 after Israel had won this stupendous victory, but that wasn't the end. The Arabs needed to regain their honor. So in 1973, the leader of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, prepared another war against Israel. And he planned to launch it on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the holiest day in the year. That's the Day of Atonement. That's when all Jews are praying, fasting in their synagogues. Well, there were very few soldiers left on the front lines. There were voices telling Israel, Egypt's getting ready to attack. But Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel, didn't believe it. Consequently, the Egyptian armies attacked, and not just the Egyptian armies, the Syrian armies and the armies of Jordan. Israel was attacked from every side. They had been surprised so thoroughly that it looked like Israel might lose that war. However, God eventually turned the tide after Israel suffered severe losses. Well, that was in 73. Finally, Israel turned the tide of the war, and that's when Egypt begged for a ceasefire from the United Nations, and the Soviet Union pressured the United Nations and the United States to declare a ceasefire because Israel had broken through the lines toward Egypt and could have gone all the way to the capital of Egypt, Cairo. They could have done that. However, they didn't want to do that. They did not want to rule over the Egyptians. Well, that was in 1973. Now I'm leading up to where we are right now. 1979 rolled around, and Anwar Sadat decided, after regaining Egyptian honor in the Yom Kippur War, it was time to make peace with Israel. Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States, and he was talking to Anwar Sadat and also to the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Menachem Begin. So they came together to great fanfare, and they formed the first peace agreement between an Arab country and Israel, between Egypt and Israel. That was 1979. Well, the Arab League was so mad at Egypt that they actually banished them from membership in the Arab League. Some 22 Arab nations said, we have nothing to do with Egypt. They forsook us. They violated the 3 no's. And so consequently, Egypt was left in isolation for a while. Well, as events continued from 1979 to 1989, the Cold War was winding down. And in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It was like peace was suddenly breaking out all over. Well, this inspired George Herbert Walker Bush and others to make an attempt at a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Finally, in 1993, by that time, Yitzhak Rabin was the leader of Israel. Yasser Arafat had become the leader of the Palestinians, and Bill Clinton was the President of the United States. I'll never forget the day I saw the picture of Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin being pulled together to shake hands, and Bill Clinton was there pulling them together. The Oslo Accords were signed. These accords were supposed to set a path to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the next 5 or 6 years. This accord divided the West Bank, the area that Israel had conquered in the '67 war, into 3 areas: Area A, B, and C. Well, when this was all divided, Area C was basically put under Israeli control. Areas A and B contained the 8 largest cities of the Palestinians in the nation of Israel. So very quickly, those cities were placed under Palestinian control. Israel didn't want the headache of ruling all the Palestinians. So they gladly surrendered that, even though Israel reserved the right, if there was an uprising, to go in militarily and to put it down. So that situation continued on. Today, Area A and B is almost under total control of the Palestinians. As a matter of fact, I go to Israel every year, and you'll see signs at the outskirts of those cities: no Jews may enter here. It is now against the law for Jews to go in there, because Israel doesn't want her citizens going in, being kidnapped, and then the Palestinians holding them ransom for 1,000 of the Palestinian terrorists being released from Israeli jails. So that's the reason it's that way. However, Area C is almost totally under Israeli control right now. However, Area C is the area that the Palestinians want for their home. They are claiming they want to have a Palestinian nation, and Area C is the part that they want to add to Area A and B. So that's the contention until even right now. Now, in 1994, the Jordanians made peace with Israel. So now Egypt has signed a peace deal with Israel. Now the Jordanians have signed a peace with Israel. Those were Israel's 2 biggest neighbors. Jordan had the longest border with Israel, and Egypt also had the largest army among the Arab neighbors of Israel. Well, finally in 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu, still living with all of this contention, made a speech at Bar-Ilan University. He stated for the first time by an Israeli prime minister that he knew that there was going to have to be two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. He said, we have two peoples living here and we need to live in peace. The world gasped for its breath when Netanyahu endorsed the two-state solution in 2009. However, it didn't happen. Things continued to move along until, well, there were many efforts at peace. Obama and John Kerry, they hosted the peace talks, all disintegrated. Ehud Olmert attempted to make peace with the Palestinians, didn't work out. First of all, Bill Clinton met for 2 weeks with Yasser Arafat and with Ehud Barak, who was at that time Prime Minister of Israel in the year 2000, trying to get a peace deal. They locked themselves in for 2 weeks. They thought they had it, but when it finally came down to the crux of the matter, Yasser Arafat said, can't do it. So there were many attempts to bring about peace. None of it worked. However, a new kind of politician rose up in America in 2016. Donald Trump, a non-politician, a businessman, announced that he was running for president. Actually, he was laughed into derision. Nobody thought he had a chance. Nevertheless, he started running, and one thing he said was, when I am elected, my goal is to bring about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He said it's the deal that can't be done. Everybody's tried, nobody's been able to. Trump, he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. He saw himself as a master negotiator. He said, I don't know that I can get it done, but I certainly would like to try. Well, Trump surprised everyone by winning the presidency in November of 2016. Once he took power in January of 2017, he immediately launched the effort to bring about peace. He was serious about it. He chose his two closest associates, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his personal lawyer of the last 20 years, Jason Greenblatt. The first week of his presidency, he told them, I want you to build a plan for peace. They swung into motion the next 7 months. They visited Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinians, 20 times, an average of 3 times a week. They were pushing. They were also visiting with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. They went to Jordan. They went to Saudi Arabia. They went to Egypt. So all those things they did. However, it all came to naught. Now, in our next session, we're going to pick up here the Abraham Accord, because you need to see the whole picture. We're watching prophecy being fulfilled right in front of our eyes right now. So whatever you do, don't miss the next session of the Abraham Accord. You've been listening to End of the Age with End Time Ministries.